I have managed to get the inner core and the inner clay part out. Again, it is very difficult to do when you leave the mold for a few days. The clay hardens up inside and you end up at times with quite a bit of damage on the mold, as you can sort of see here, these parts and the back of the head. What I do now is I'm going to clean this up, and I usually just use a piece of clay and tap it so to remove that, and then I cover it in either soap or Vaseline. I probably use soap this time because that is easier to add plaster in the positive if you need to. And I also break the edges of this mold. A slightly bigger tool than this, but this is also something you need to do. You need to break the edge of the mold. We come to that later on. Now, generally, if your mold is badly cracked up or broken, it is not a catastrophe. So this is actually a good result because the main molds are intact. Sometimes molds break in two if you're not versatile in making it, but you can always sort of patch them up with patches of Hessian covered in plaster. You bring the molds together and then you cover the cracks up from outside, obviously. So what I'm going to do is I clean this up, break the edges, and I'm not going to fix anything. So I got to cast this, so I insulate this with soap, and then I sand it down in the positive. Take it away in the positive is way easier. So do not be too frustrated if your mold you're making has a lot of damage, because the repair job in the positive is actually quite swift. Okay, so I have covered the surface with soap. I just use some ordinary soap and I brush it in, and I'm lucky enough that we have a compressed air here, so I use a compressed air blower to get these sort of foamy parts out. You can equally use a brush, but an air compressor is actually quite good because it pushes the soap into all the nooks and crannies you usually don't reach. You can also then, I use soap because it's easier to add plaster after you made the cast. If you use something like Vaseline gel or sort of petrol jelly, it's much more, because you can wash the soap off. You have a sort of a clean surface to work with when you then work on the plaster. I want to work this plaster over in order to end up with two options. I either leave it. No, there are three options actually. I either leave it just as a plaster piece, or I make a 3 or 4 part mold in order to then produce this in ceramics, or I make again a 3 or 4 part mold taken and use it for a concrete cast, or I make a silicone mold. Not quite sure whether I want to do all that work. And then you have various options. It is possible to make in ceramics, but obviously with the ceramic mold, you tend to go for a plaster negative mold, not silicone, because you need the absorbent of the plaster mold. So when you use wet clay in a plaster mold, you want the mold, the plaster mold bone dry. It sucks the moisture out of the clay. It shrinks a little bit, and you can get this off. Obviously, you need to make a piece mold to get the individual pieces off. But next step here is make a plaster positive, and then I work on the plaster. So here is the mold joined together, and I have poured plaster in 2 sections. So first a big bucket, and then I rolled this mold on the floor so that I get an even layer inside. Sometimes that doesn't work. So I mixed up a second bucket and I used strips of Hessian, kind of moved in and placed this inside. So this should be hopefully thick enough to get about a layer like this. So our next step is now to chisel the mold away, and we'll see. There will be always a bit of a repair job, but I think this should be, hopefully the layer should be thick enough. I didn't fill the entire cavity with plaster because it will make this object hugely heavy. And once you have actually, if you fill this solidly with plaster, you get a huge lump of plaster drying up or reacting, and thus heating up, and you get distortions. So actually getting a hollow cast is much better. It is a little bit tricky to kind of get a reasonably even layer, but if you do that, if you have bigger pieces, you always aim for a cast thickness of about 2 inches or 45 mil ideally on bigger casts. That will make a very solid cast. So I'm waiting now for this to dry, and then I start chiseling away.